you ready for Bob Dylan in the 1980s? It's a decade that includes Christian Bob, Zionist Bob, Disco Bob, and whatever the hell down in the groove Bob is. If you didn't watch the 1960s and 1970s videos, I encourage you to. But to save you an unnecessarily elaborate preamble, let us begin. 20. Saved. Oh, Saved. This album is unnecessarily malign, and I think what most people bristle against is the evangelism of it. What people love about Bob is that he is sort of anti-ideologue. The ideologue in question could be a racist politician, it could be somebody who wants him to stay in one artistic lane at the expense of all the others. It could be cops who falsely imprison somebody like Hurricane Carter. But generally speaking, his best songs are anti-ideological, I would contend. I think people who fall in love with Bob's music for its anti-ideological quality bristle against this album's ideological stance. I am one of these people to some extent, but I still see a lot of value in this album that people tend to dismiss. For example, I think In the Garden has a tremendous chord progression and sort of an interesting, edgy energy. Saving Grace and Covenant Woman both have interesting music to me. I also admit to being roused sometimes by the rock and roll energy of Solid Rock, or the fast-paced gospel rock of Saved. Another reason I think people compare this unfavorably to Slow Train Coming is Slow Train Coming seemed to have a unique production aesthetic. Mellow gospel rock. I don't know that he invented it, but it had an aesthetic distinctness. A lot of the songs on Saved feel like imitations of a gospel aesthetic that predated Bob. There is a lot musically that's interesting about this album. A couple of its songs are keepers. All you can sort of hope to do is share in the energy of Bob's revelation. It does belong in the lower reaches of his tier list, but it is not so devoid of value that it deserves the unqualified panning that it gets from a lot of critics. I would put it just south of Street Legal in the C tier. 21. Shot of Love. Shot of Love is a little bit like the New Morning of the gospel period. There were a lot of Dylan fans then and a lot of Dylan fans now who see the Christian phase as Bob losing his way. Shot of Love is generally thought of as the album where he begins to find it again. And again, I'm kind of in the middle here. I don't see the gospel period as Bob losing his way, nor do I feel like Shot of Love is him really finding his way again. As is usually the case, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Unlike Saved, Shot of Love has a unique and fresh poetics. Shot of Love, The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, Every Grain of Sand. If you listen sort of superficially to the language, it sounds like he's trying to tell you stories about real people he knows or has interacted with. But if you really focus on the lyrics, you realize that it's actually sort of this kaleidoscopic story where details fly in from one angle and fly in from another angle. You may be in the same place as earlier in the verse, you may be in a completely different place from earlier in the verse. When the aesthetic works, as it does in The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, the end result is like looking at a Hieronymus Bosch painting. It's this miasma of interestingly rendered sensory information. It short-circuits my rational mind and puts me into this poetically meditative state that I love to be in. At its best, Shot of Love is the development of this new poetics that Bob would carry through to Infidels, and that I think you could even draw a through line to some of his great later work like Love and Theft. At its worst though, it's just kind of boring. Trouble, for example, despite some memorable turns of phrase, musically it is the same approach as many of the other harder, bluesier songs on the album, and the overarching sentiment or idea is pretty vapid. There's trouble all over the place. Okay. Property of Jesus, I don't know if I can get behind. There's something sweet and vulnerable about it, but I think it's the vapors of Bob's Christian faith. What's interesting about Shot of Love, it has an emerging poetics that is occasionally crystallized, but mostly still in development, but it's a very pleasurable album. The informality of tracks like Heart of Mine and Watered Down Love is sweet and pleasurable. It's certainly not asking of you what Saved asked of you, which is to deal with Bob's evangelism for 40 minutes or so. I like this album, but I don't think it deserves a place of honor in his discography. I would put it ahead of Street Legal and behind his debut album in the C tier. You should listen to his debut album first, but it has some kind of unique value. 22. Infidels. This is for sure the 1980s Bob album that I've listened to the most. Of all his 80s work, the poetic heights on this one are the highest. I can't say enough about Joker Man. I love everything about it. I would stack it against anything from Bringing It All Back Home in terms of poetry. A Sweetheart Like You to me is a poetic investigation into what is kind of a cliche movie line. What's a sweetheart like you doing in a dump like this? What does the asker of that question have in their backstory that makes them qualified to ask that question? And what are they trying to get from somebody who doesn't seem like they belong in this hovel? And what is this hovel? I is a continuation of that poetics that I was talking about in Shot of Love. At first glance, it seems like a story. The more you probe at it, the less it seems like a story, and the more that seemingly simple phrases reveal surprising complexity. The thing that makes this album hard to evaluate is it also has some very bad songs on it. Songs that are not necessarily badly written, but that just to me have never resonated. Neighborhood Bully is one of those. The issue I think with Man of Peace is largely production. It has such unwelcome and unhelpful studio polish. It has like 3 instrumental breaks in the studio take that are all of which are kind of unnecessary. Union Sundown is another one. It seems like he's forcing ideological stances that I'm not always sure I agree with, and I sort of doubt his conviction to some extent. It's also the beginning of him doing this thing he did in the mid-80s, saying girl a lot in the lyrics, doing these little affected laughs on the mic. It just smacks of midlife crisis to me. I suppose midlife crises are inevitable to some extent, but they're also kind of just sad to witness. Infidels has such high poetic heights, and also probably 3 songs that I really don't like listening to out of its 8. I'm actually gonna put it just in front of Desire in the B tier. 23, Empire Burlesque. The thing I want to say about Empire Burlesque up top is that it does not suck. Some people may tell you that it sucks, and it doesn't. I would say this album has several songs that are very interestingly written. A song like Tight Connection to My Heart is not powerfully well written, but there is a lot in it that's interesting. They're beating the devil out of a guy wearing a powder blue wig. Sure. When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky, I think, has a lot of power in it, but its power is blunted somewhat by its production and by its structure. It's too long, there's too many instrumental breaks, I would delete a verse. What I don't like about this album are the ballads. In the 80s, I think he developed this way of writing ballads that they feel like token emotional songs. I'll Remember You feels that way to me. Emotionally Yours, Never Gonna Be the Same Again. The reason I find the ostensible emotion in those songs hard to accept is that the writing is sort of stale. The rhymes are stale, the structures are just inherited from pop structures. There's not enough that's inventive about them to make me feel that the emotion is deeply rooted in something inspiring. There is a good helping of interesting writing on this album, there is a good helping of very uninteresting writing to me, and there is just a cherry on top of the Odd Sunday of Dark Eyes, which is a powerfully well-written song. It's not an album that sucks, but it's also not an album that's any more interesting than anything in the B tier. I would put it just above Shot of Love in the C tier. The C tier is turning into albums that are not great in their own right, but that have a lot that's interesting to investigate poetically. If life turns you into a deep Bob fan, these are albums that you ought to at some point hear. 24, Knocked Out Loaded. Before recording this video, I went back and listened through these albums again just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I was so prepared to hate this album, and then I could not get myself to hate it. The crown jewel of this album is Brownsville Girl, which it's the great unknown classic of Bob's catalog. Like, people know Desolation Row, people kind of know It's Alright Ma. Not enough people know Brownsville Girl. It's fascinating. It is peculiar and funny and long, and it just radiates something intoxicating. Bob trying to do the cool guy 80s Bob thing, wearing vests with nothing underneath and long feathery earrings Bob. This is as close as that Bob gets to being credible. Songs that fall into that category include Maybe Someday, Drifting Too Far From Shore, Got My Mind Made Up, Under Your Spell, and You Wanna Ramble. I wouldn't put any of those songs on a playlist for a new Bob Dylan fan, but if you find your way to Under Your Spell, like, you're gonna be glad you did. They Killed Him is a song I really like, and this production is just horrendous. The children's choir, the automatic horns, it's bad, but it's like sweet bad. It's like somebody trying to do you a favor and kind of missing the mark, but you appreciate that they tried. Just to be clear, this is not a tremendously good album, but there is one truly great song on this album, and then of the 7 others, there are 4 or 5 entirely listenable songs, and then 2 kind of forgettable ones. It's not a great album, but it has the decency not to waste too much of your time. It's high C tier Bob to me. 25, Down in the Groove. If Shot of Love is the 1980s New Morning, this is definitely its self-portrait. It's a hodgepodge of covers and originals, some of which he wrote by himself, some of which he co-wrote. There are many who will and have disagreed with me, but the covers don't have that spark of magic that he is so capable of bringing to covers. I think it's partly because he's choosing songs that don't really suit his unique artistic capabilities. Let's Stick Together just doesn't really suit them. If you're gonna cover a song, you want to bring something essential to it. There's nothing enduring about his arrangement of that. or his arrangement of When Did You Leave Heaven, or Sally Sue Brown. The only covers on this album, to me, that have anything essential about them are Rank Strangers to Me and Shenandoah. Shenandoah, it's not quite a great arrangement, but it has something. It's unique in the way that he's playing it. There's a unique energy he brings to it. The take they captured is like not the full realization of that energy, but it's got something. Rank Strangers to Me I would describe almost identically. Listening to this album is a very peculiar experience. You would be well advised to take the couple of good songs on this album and then kind of chuck the rest of it. Unless I'm required to render another opinion on it for some reason, I don't think I'm gonna listen to it again. I would put this behind Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in the D tier. 26, Oh Mercy. As a Bob fan, you find yourself waiting for these moments where it sounds like he's really invested. A lot of the time, both in the studio and live, it doesn't sound like he cares. So then the albums or the shows where it seems like he's been struck by some spontaneous bolt of inspiration, fans tend to glom onto. I think the reason why people tend to like this album is because it sounds like Bob gives a shit. In a lot of cases on this album, the plaudits that it tends to get are warranted. Ring Them Bells is a terrific song. Shooting Star is a terrific song. This is not my favorite version of Most of the Time, but it's a very tender composition. Where Teardrops Fall feels a little half-baked to me, but it has something. However, the fact that it seems like Bob gives a shit tempts people to overrate a lot of these songs. Political World, for example. First of all, the phrase "we live in a political world," I don't think it has any meaning. It's like the meme, the "we live in a society" meme. Put Political World up against Leonard Cohen's song from a similar time period, The Future. The Future is similarly cynical about human nature, but it has a lot more poetic credibility, in my view. Everything Is Broken, likewise. It's this sort of weird, like, broad brush statement, de facto cynicism that I don't totally agree with. Man in the Long Black Coat is sort of a shell of an outlaw song. Oh Mercy is interesting. There are some really terrific songs, some songs that are entirely good, and some songs that I consider half-baked and that I think people overrate because it sounds like Bob himself is invested. Yeah, I would put this in the very low B tier. 1980s. It's a perplexing decade. He tried a lot of stuff in this decade that didn't work. He made some production moves that are just baffling in retrospect. A lot of the 1980s for him feels like treading water, but still it has some unbelievable poetic heights. I've learned something from almost all of these albums, maybe with the exception of Down in the Groove. The good news is that a lot of Bob's best work is yet to come. So, as ever, stay tuned. I cordially invite you to like this video and subscribe to my page, and thank you very much for watching.